Welcome back to Pulling It All Together. Last week, we looked at the history of the northeastern states in America between the years of 1801 to 1810. This week, we're looking at the southern states between those same dates, 1801 to 1810. Next week, we'll look at the Midwest. The week after that, we'll look at the American West within those same dates. So, some new additions that I've made here to this spreadsheet. On the far right, you see key events as a column. It's the fourth column that I've got here. And what I'm doing is I'm using this as an index. It's not really populated with a lot of content at this particular point, but I will include key events here as we move throughout the history and do stuff that it's, of course, American, but at the same time, international history as well. Another big development is I have done additional work on the White House by putting content on specific dates throughout a given year. For Congress, what I found is that Congress did not meet all the time. They were meeting 12 months out of the year, just like they don't now, but they met far less in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, than they do now. So if we take a look here at April of 1801, you can see that the 6th Congress was not in session, nor were they in session in May, and June, and July, and August, and September, October, November. Finally, in December, they get back into session when the 7th Congress formed and had their first session on December 7th. And the 7th Congress then carried over into January, and into February, and into March, and into April. And finally, they were not in session here in June and continued to be so out of session until December. So, what I'm trying to do is put the key landmark legislation within the time period that Congress is actually meeting. All right, same thing for the Supreme Court. So I'll just head up here. We can see that the Supreme Court in February of 1802, for example, was meeting for their February term. I've got some more information about the Supreme Court as it relates to 1802, but that's shaded out here, which means they weren't in session, but I've got additional information just about the Supreme Court that particular year. So you'll be able to follow a little better what's happening in Congress, what's happening in the Supreme Court by looking at the cells that are shaded and the ones that aren't. And that continues all the way down through 1810, which is the time frame for the videos that we are doing now. Now, last week we looked at the northeastern states from Maine all the way to Pennsylvania, which is how at least one formulation of the northeastern states was defined. This week we look at the southern states, and the rationale for that is, much of American history, of course, started in the northeast and then trickled down south before moving out to the Midwest and then out to the further American West. So we're looking at Delaware all the way to Louisiana in this particular week. So the cool thing is with the spreadsheet is you can see, for example, that Arkansas in August of 1806 was part of the Louisiana Territory. You can see that Mississippi was part of the Mississippi Territory, as was also Alabama. Florida was under Spanish control. Georgia was already a state. The DR indicates that the dominant political party at that particular time in Georgia was that of the Democratic Republicans, which would have been in support of Thomas Jefferson. Same for South Carolina, same for North Carolina, same for Tennessee. Virginia, or West Virginia was not yet a state, so I didn't put a political designation there. But Virginia definitely was Democratic / Republican or dash Republican. The party of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and definitely not the party of Alexander Hamilton or John Adams or Chief Justice John Marshall, or even going back to George Washington. So there's a lot of history on here that I think you'll find interesting, and I'm not going to wade through all of it, but it is interesting to take, let me go to 1807. One key event that happened there was the Embargo Act of 1807. And how did that affect any given state? You can scroll across in that given year in 1808, for example, once this really comes into effect, and see how it was affecting particular industries in particular locations. So that's pretty cool. Let me show you one other key development, and I'm not going greatly in depth on the southern states here, all that's in the spreadsheet, but I'm going to scroll over further and further and further past the other states and get down here to the beginning, for example, of 1809. And we've got additional topics that we have included here that summarized that topic for this particular year. So, for example, music, and we can see that Beethoven was, in the middle of the classical style, and what particular works he did. Same for visual arts and architecture, science and technology, literature, transportation, philosophy. Then we get into a little bit of religion here because that's just so essential to the flow of human history. We've got Roman Catholicism, Protestantism. We've got Islam, Hinduism. So at least those four things. And it's fascinating to look through and see what was happening in any given year of history. We'll get into these topics much more in depth and break them down in greater detail, but this is just a nice thumbnail summary to give you a sense of what was happening in these topics as you look through the given history of any state in any given year. We've got the culinary arts, and then, of course, summaries of the United States, Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa, and that's all cool to take a look at. But check this out. This is the really cool thing. Let me go back to 1801. I've decided to add columns for the U.S. presidents. So if we go to January of 1801, we can see that George Washington, he's grayed out. That means he's no longer alive. He died here in December of 1799. Let me go ahead and make that cell white because he was still alive the first half of that month. But when he's shaded out, he's no longer alive. So I'll go back to January of 1801. You can see Benjamin Franklin has also passed away. But Alexander Hamilton is still alive. And John Adams being coded in yellow, that means that he was president. You can see the F next to his name. He was a Federalist, and he was located in Washington, D.C. at this particular point. Barely, because he moved from Philadelphia prior to that in November. So he moved into the White House long enough, basically, to get voted out of office. So Jefferson takes over then as president, as indicated by the yellow, in March of 1801. So if I were to scroll across and think, okay, what's happening in March of 1801 with the other future presidents, you can see that Madison was Secretary of State. I have yet to fill in Monroe and John Quincy Adams, but I have done a little bit of work on some of the others. Andrew Jackson was in Nashville, Tennessee. Van Buren was in New York. Tyler was in Virginia. Polk was in North Carolina. Taylor was in Kentucky. Fillmore was in New York, and Franklin Pierce had yet to be born. Same with Abraham Lincoln and the rest. But James Buchanan was attending the old Stone Academy in Pennsylvania at that particular point. So I will continue to update the presidential columns with content that tends to be slightly more biographical than just the pure executive actions associated with the office of the White House and, the executive position. So anyway, enjoy looking through that stuff. That's going to be really fun to continue to add content to this. Now, just keep in mind that you can download this spreadsheet for free. I say for free, actually, if you subscribe to Substack. It feels like it's free because there's so much content here that I really think is going to be a benefit to anybody who is a student of history and just wants to pull it all together, which is the theme of this whole project, is to be able to see a lot of different things and see the connections between those things. So if you subscribe to Substack, then what I'll do is I'll put a link to this Excel file, and you can just simply download that. Next week, I'll have an updated one that will feature the Midwest between the years 1801 and 1810. The week after that, we'll look at the American West, and then we'll just continue to roll through the decades of history until we reach the present. And after that point, we'll probably go back to the year 1700 and really look at the formation of the United States, look at the history of the Native American tribes, and just kind of figure out how all that, with the spirit of manifest destiny, all that fit together. So we'll look at international stuff too at some point. I'll have other special topics dealing with sports, dealing with popular culture, dealing with art. Just a lot of different things that I think you'll find very fascinating. If you're a subscriber, then you'll be able to download the spreadsheets and revise them as you wish. You can always take the new content that I have, copy it over onto your stuff. You can add your stuff to my content, so whatever works for you. I think this could be a powerful tool for you. I will see you next week with a focus on the American Midwest in the years 1801 to 1810.